Welcome back to what I'm calling another Secular Saturday sermon. Today I'm going to read something first that I have pre-written that'll just kind of give this predefined clarity to what I want to talk about, and then maybe discuss it off the cuff a little bit more. But here is the reading first, okay? So I'm going to be reading off screen. The script should be flipped. I was raised to think that humanity needs saved from its default state. Buried in that belief was the idea that the state that humanity is in today is its default state. I have come to disagree with the idea that humanity needs saved per se, and with the idea that humanity's current state is its default. By the way, my main reasons for disagreeing with these ideas are mental health or psychosocial reasons. But in order to turn around and still make use of that narrative that I was taught, it's relevant to point out that the default state for humans seems to be one of curiosity and cooperation above most other things in our lives. To try to be lazy and get dopamine rushes for things that you don't really accomplish when other people did most of the work and you just take the credit, that is not really a default human state at all. It's our so-called sinful state, to use moralistic language. And it's our assumption that it is our default state in our current so-called civilized culture. But it's a lie we share. It's a misunderstanding that we hold in our minds. And by the way, conversely, to work oneself to death like an abused horse is not a default human state either. But we can't just swing the other way and pretend like we've somehow solved the core problem. In other words, we can't just all become slaves or all become masters and assume we've somehow resolved the immoral contradiction inherent in our hierarchical society. The core problem is that we split humanity into the haves and have-nots, or the workers and those that get to take credit. And so the solution is that we need to stop thinking in terms of this dichotomy. We need to instead embrace our natural humanity. But my point for now goes back to the idea that whatever fucked up version of humanity people are being tempted to act like, that version should not be treated like it's the default. Therefore, we shouldn't go around talking like we need a savior to save us from our default state. We should look at our productive state as our default state. Our effective, communicative, cooperative state, this should be considered our default state. And if that's the case, then when we deviate from that default state, we effectively choose to act like assholes or idiots. We are not, by default, assholes and idiots, needing saved from ourselves. Instead, we get corrupted instead of encouraged and taught. Whether it feels like it or not, we effectively choose, either collectively or as individuals or both, to be and act and then remain corrupted. So no, we don't need a savior. We just need to own our choices enough to ask ourselves if the choices that we are actively making seem genuine to us. Despite my somewhat weak reading of that, I think that I almost can't add to it, and yet I'm going to be kind of real and allow myself to be here in this moment with you, because I think there's value in that, which is why I've sort of started this series. And I will say, this isn't just some kind of a gimmicky message, right? It wasn't just a one-time idea. When it first hit me, it was interesting, but I developed it over time, edited that little writing there. And I really do think that it's a good way to attack, I guess, our thinking in how we just accept the narrative that there is something we are trying to escape. Of course, I grew up with a Christian narrative, and you may have guessed that. if you have enough experience just with religion or analyzing religions, you may have guessed that in what you heard me say already. I may have kind of hinted at that. But I think there are parallels even to other religious traditions and temptations, really, that we have to pretend like we have our thinking figured out whenever we are thinking that we need to figure out how to escape the, travails or difficulties in life in any form, right? Because in Buddhism, as a great example also, there is this inherent idea, right, that we are suffering. There is built into that the assumption that what we are doing in the world is not just coincidentally suffering at some level or even occasionally, but that we actually are living in suffering. And so there's this assumption that we need to escape that suffering in some sense. And the solution that Buddhism offers, philosophically speaking, is one by which you come to understand suffering in such a way that you can sort of mentally and in principle escape it indefinitely. There is a similarity there between that way of thinking and the traditions that it came out of and the assumption of Judaism that there was some sort of what came to be called eventually by Christians and in English at least original sin that humanity somehow performed or got themselves into. And whether you make that a philosophical concept and you try to describe what that is, or you try to believe literally and as like a fundamentalist that Adam and Eve are a literal story and it had to have happened in this very literal way, it's like no matter what you interpret in the details of those stories and the literality of the stories, there's a principle there that if you want to step back from it, if you're willing to think about it at all, you can't deny there's a common principle there, just like there is in that Buddhist narrative. And that common principle is that you cannot, this assumption that you can't escape the darkness, I guess, of this negativity of human existence, that there is an overarching or pervasive sort of negativity to the way we live now, and that you have to work to escape that. And so when the Judeo-Christian narrative says in various forms that there was originally a state in which humanity may have not had that problem, it still, you find, takes over now in the narrative. It takes over that this is the problem we find ourselves in. And it sort of slips into our thinking this idea as if to say that, there's no way to think outside of this state that we find ourselves in that is at some level overwhelmingly negative. And if you take that in the reincarnation sense and you say, well, let's try to take it back to some sort of original state in which you could hypothesize that in some form we were energy and that in that state we were pure, and whatever you might mean by that, there was this purity before we got stuck in the cycles of reincarnation. If you take that thinking from those traditions and those cultures and you ruminate over that, there's in some sense the same pervasive feeling that this negativity has taken over, to the degree that we may not even step back from it enough to realize that we don't think of that that purity state as the default anymore. We think of the state that we believe and feel that we are in now as the default state. And that is, again, at some level, overwhelmingly negative. And to own that and be aware of that is almost like taking some power back right there, right away. But to admit that fully and go, what can we conclude from that? Maybe, even so much more powerful than the already powerful admission that we are acting that way. That power that we can unlock is huge, really, in practical terms, though, right? It doesn't need to be spiritualized. It doesn't need to be like, oh my God, you've unlocked this beautiful spiritual power. It doesn't need to be spiritualized like that. It doesn't need to be magnified to an extent that you can't even wrap your mind around it anymore. It doesn't need to be turned into that. It's very real. It's very practical. You can unlock a power by saying, hey, you know what? Our default state is not this. And we can continually question that default state more and more by continuing to explore why it's not our default state. We can question our current state, by continuing to explore why it's not our default state. How did we get here? It is a real thing. It really happened, and this thing that we call civilization at large, at broad, our hierarchical structures that we've built into our recent societies and humanity has sort of codified this state that we're currently in as our default, but it's not our default. And when you unlock your thinking so that it's not associating our current state with default anymore, you have all this power to start taking things back, taking your own humanity back, which runs a lot deeper than the problems that we currently are in just because of our hierarchical societies for the last few thousand years. Sure, maybe you could say inevitably our current societies had to have roots that go back even farther than thousands of years. Yes, but in so many senses, we've got to face the first layer of that. And the first layer of that is that we have this pervasive and almost overwhelming sense collectively as a global humanity. We have this natural sense built into our cultures and our ethics and our religions that begs us to come up with these narratives to explain why we feel that we are in this negative state. And yet, so far, we have asked ourselves to come up with narratives that explain it in such a way that we treat it as if it's our default state. What if we change just that? It opens up a whole way of questioning that state then. If we don't assume that what we are in is default, if we don't assume that it is forever, if we don't assume that it doesn't have an origin and it is just sort of inevitable and it is what we are supposed to be or something ridiculous like that, we can take the power back by asking questions at that point then and say, look, we can understand this and probably change it over time, actively, ourselves. No more need for a savior. No more need for spiritualizing everything. No more need for waiting around. That's the power in that. And I don't think that if I came at you with my full passion on this, right, I could speak to it quite the same as I needed to do, I felt that I needed to do in this talk first. Because this talk I felt like needed to be more of an outline of that, right? And if you're convinced that there's any value in what I'm saying, I think it's because you actually heard something that I said. And I needed to say it from that perspective first. But it does make me kind of passionate too. And I love, the idea that we can actually change the world at a big level. Like, that's what's driven me for years. But figuring out how to do that, why we can do that, what are the philosophical shifts necessary in order to really do that, is what's going to make it happen, right? So you have to sort of contain that passion and channel it and talk about it and break it down and continue to show that it's okay to do this work. Not only is it okay, it's great. It frees our minds more and more in good ways, productive ways. But yeah, that's it. I don't have like a fancy conclusion out of that. I just feel like if you were grabbed by anything that I was saying, then you're going to get that there was a flow to this. And you're going to be either encouraged, right, to explore that more or to bring it out of you more, or made curious to explore it, discover it, and find it more if you think that it's something that feels more new to you. Either way, you will have been grabbed by that sense of flow and that sense of freedom and the sense that maybe we can actually understand our feelings that we have typically traditionally classed as sort of abstract, spiritual, or religious. That we can actually turn them into understanding instead, sort of make them a science, not lose the passion at all, instead actually fulfill that passion. Actually do something with it finally instead of just containing it and taking it to church with us and then that's it. No, do something. Change the world. Don't just wait around for something to change. Can't think of anything else to add to that. So that's it. Cool.